Hello, and welcome to this presentation regarding the U.S. EPA's proposed cleanup plan for the Nucor Steel facility in Marion, Ohio. We hope that you find this presentation helpful and informative. This presentation will provide background information on the Nucor Steel facility and explain EPA's proposed cleanup plan. EPA recently issued a document called a Statement of Basis to describe the proposed cleanup plan and will gather the public's comments and questions about the plan. Nucor's Statement of Basis can be found on the website for the Nucor facility that is shown on the next slide. After an open public comment period, EPA will provide responses to public questions and comments in a final decision document. This presentation provides the same information as an in-person meeting. There are many ways you can submit your questions or comments to EPA. You can leave a confidential voicemail at 312-886-7613. You can submit a comment directly on the website shown on the slide. You can also email the site's Community Involvement Coordinator, Francisco Arcaute, at arcaute.francisco@epa.gov. And finally, you can mail your written or typed comments to Francisco Arcaute at US EPA, 77 West Jackson Boulevard, 19th floor, Chicago, Illinois, 60604. We understand that you may have questions regarding the proposed cleanup plan after watching this presentation. We invite you to join EPA representatives during an open question and answer session on May 4, 2023, from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Dial 312-667-5632 and enter the conference code 111950-271 and # when prompted. Once again, that number is 312-667-5632 with the conference code 111950-271 #. I will now hand the presentation over to the EPA Project Manager, Monica Onishko, to provide background information and explain the proposed cleanup plan for Nucor Steel.
Again, my name is Monica Onishko, and I'm an EPA Project Manager in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, Corrective Action Program. I am the Project Manager for the Nucor Steel facility. Over the next few slides, I will provide background information and describe some of the investigation and cleanup activities previously performed at the site. I will also discuss EPA's proposed cleanup plan. The facility is currently owned by Nucor Steel and is located at 912 Cheney Avenue in Marion, Ohio. The facility is located near the southwestern edge of the city of Marion, east of Cheney Avenue and south of Bellefontaine Avenue. The facility occupies approximately 40 acres. The figure depicts the approximate site boundaries. As you can see in the figure, Nucor Steel is surrounded by industrial property to the west and east, and mixed commercial and residential to the east, north, and south. Various companies have produced steel at the facility. In 1915, Pollock Steel began steelmaking operations at the site, followed by Armco Steel and Marion Steel. Nucor Steel purchased the steel mill in 2005. Nucor Steel produces reinforcement bars, fence posts, and angle iron in two 30-ton electric arc furnaces. The electric arc furnace steelmaking process generates air emissions. Nucor's electric arc furnaces are located in the melt shop. Dust emissions from this shop are ducted to a baghouse, which is an air pollution control device. Historically, a Nucor predecessor operated two surface waste disposal areas, impoundments, to store emission control dust from the electric arc furnaces. The steel mill was permitted by EPA as a RCRA treatment, storage, and disposal facility and is subject to corrective action. EPA's Resource Conservation and Recovery Act was created to regulate companies that treat, store, or dispose of hazardous wastes. It created laws for the proper handling of hazardous waste to prevent sites from becoming Superfund sites. Superfund sites often use EPA resources and taxpayer dollars to investigate and clean up contamination at facilities because they have already become inactive, without an owner or responsible party. EPA's RCRA program seeks to limit the use of taxpayer dollars by giving EPA the authority to oversee the cleanup of hazardous wastes by the owners of those facilities while they are still active. The owner or responsible party, in this case Nucor Steel, is obligated to follow EPA guidance and must receive EPA's approval on all the elements of the project to meet these obligations. Nucor proposed to conduct voluntary investigations at this site to identify past releases of hazardous contaminants and take any additional corrective action steps needed at the facility. EPA agreed to this approach and oversaw the investigation and cleanup. The RCRA corrective action cleanup process is flexible, depending on site-specific conditions. A typical cleanup includes steps such as facility investigation and characterization, interim measures, evaluation of remedial alternatives, remedy selection, implementation of the selected remedy, and long-term care. Now, I'll explain how EPA's corrective action process works, then explain what corrective action activities Nucor has completed at the facility. During the initial site investigation, state or EPA technicians gather information on site conditions, releases, potential releases, and exposure pathways, which are the link between a contaminant source and a receptor. The information obtained is used to characterize the nature and extent of contamination at the facility, to identify areas of potential concern, and determine whether a cleanup is needed. Timelines for this process vary by site. Before a final remedy is selected, corrective action facilities may need interim measures to address uncontrolled risks. Interim measures are more immediate steps taken to control ongoing risks to human health and the environment before final remedy selection. An example of an interim measure is removing highly contaminated soils. Facility owners-operators of a RCRA site will typically analyze a range of cleanup alternatives and evaluate what works best for their facility-specific conditions. Nucor has completed these initial steps in the corrective action process and is ready to select a remedy or cleanup plan. Before I speak about the remedy, I will explain the corrective action activities Nucor has completed at the facility to date. During the corrective action process, sites undergo environmental investigations that study where possible contamination, meaning hazardous waste or toxic materials, is located, and any potential impacts to people or the environment. Nucor conducted, with EPA oversight, environmental investigations to determine the nature and extent of contamination at the steel mill. In 1989, the initial investigation was conducted at the Nucor site. When a facility investigation takes place at a corrective action site, areas known to have been used to store or dispose of waste are identified. Those areas are referred to as Solid Waste Management Units, or SMUs. Other areas of suspected impacts are referred to as Areas of Concern, or AOCs. This initial investigation report identified wastes generated by the facility and their potential for release, as well as 21 solid waste management units and 3 areas of concern. In 2008, EPA contacted Nucor to obtain historic information about the facility. Nucor had little prior information about waste management activities conducted by previous owners. From 2009 to 2011, Nucor conducted soil and groundwater sampling to investigate contamination in the solid waste management units and areas of concern. The investigation found that 14 areas indicated releases of contaminants above screening levels. EPA's screening levels are designed to err on the side of caution. There are different screening levels, some for human health and others for wildlife. When a sample is above a screening level, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing harm or presenting a risk. It means that the collected data needs to move on to the next phase of study, a risk assessment. Risk assessments are used in many fields of study and are used to determine the type and amount of risk in a given scenario. From 2012 to 2017, Nucor sought to collect information to fulfill data gaps to complete risk characterization of the facility. With this additional data, Nucor was able to complete an ecological and human health risk characterization. Prior investigations detected volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, at Nucor's former oil room at the maintenance shop, where the current laboratory and melt shop office and maintenance room buildings are located. Volatile organic compounds can evaporate from polluted soil and groundwater and rise toward the ground surface into an overlying building or structure. This is called a vapor intrusion. Because of the possibility of vapor intrusion, from 2017 to 2019, Nucor evaluated the vapor intrusion pathway at the former oil room by collecting soil gas samples. EPA also investigated the potential of wind-blown off-site migration of contaminants from the steel mill's melt shop into the surrounding neighborhoods. In 2021, EPA modeled the air emissions from the steel mill to determine how far and in what direction emissions could be emitted, looked at historical soil sampling data, and completed a statistical analysis of the data. EPA concluded that Nucor's air emissions did not cause off-site contamination. To reiterate, the intent of the investigations was to identify wastes generated by the Nucor facility and to characterize the nature and extent of contamination at the steel mill. Environmental investigations at Nucor found that hazardous wastes generated by facility operations included electric arc furnace dust and ignitable wastes generated during signpost painting operations. During sampling soil, groundwater, and soil gas at the facility, contaminants such as volatile organic compounds and lead in soil and groundwater were identified. Those contaminants are shown in this table. Impacted areas within the Nucor facility were divided into 10 different exposure units. These exposure units contain the solid waste management units and areas of concern that were identified in historic investigations. Later in this presentation, I will discuss exposure units and their role in estimating risk at the site. Interim measures are cleanup actions conducted before the final remedy is approved. Nucor performed 8 interim measures at the facility based on environmental investigations that evaluated risks to human health and the environment. The interim measures completed at Nucor are shown in this table and include excavating contaminated soil, vacuuming lubrication oil and groundwater, and dechlorination to remove the contaminant trichloroethene, or TCE, in soil and groundwater. TCE is a type of volatile organic compound used in industrial processes to remove grease from metal parts. So, through interim measures, Nucor has already completed soil and groundwater cleanups in several facility areas. With the goal of managing remaining risk at the facility, Nucor presented 7 remediation alternatives to EPA. EPA evaluated the alternatives to determine how to best select a cleanup plan that will offer long-term human health and environmental protection. Within the RCRA Corrective Action Program, EPA has established performance standards that are useful for evaluating and selecting remedies, known as threshold criteria and balancing criteria. Threshold criteria determine if a remedy is acceptable, meaning protective of human health and the environment. Balancing criteria assist in selecting from a range of acceptable remedies. First, a cleanup alternative must meet 3 threshold criteria to be further considered by EPA. Next, 7 balancing criteria are used to compare the alternatives that have met the threshold criteria. After this comparison is completed, a preferred remediation alternative is identified and presented to the public. EPA considered the 7 remediation alternatives Nucor presented, considering the interim measures that were already completed by Nucor. EPA found that remedies remain to be completed at exposure units 2 and 3. EPA evaluated Nucor's remediation recommendations for exposure units 2 and 3 and accepted those that met the threshold and balancing criteria. EPA also proposes additional actions to address the contamination remaining at the facility. As previously mentioned, EPA's objective is to manage risk at the facility. EPA uses risk assessment to characterize the nature and magnitude of risks to human health for various populations, for example, residents and recreational visitors, both children and adults. Risks remaining at the Nucor site that require remedial actions include potential exposure pathways, such as skin contact or inhalation, potentially affecting workers and wildlife. To assess impacts on nearby wildlife, Nucor examined local animal habitats near the facility, as well as nearby protected species of animals and plants. Since no soil or groundwater impacts extend off-site, there appears to be no risk to surrounding plants and animals. For evaluating human risk, Nucor used different pollutant criteria values, such as regional screening levels, or RSLs, to determine if soil or groundwater was impacted by any residual constituents of concern. RSLs are chemical-specific concentrations for individual contaminants in air, drinking water, and soil that may warrant further investigation. Nucor also calculated exposure point concentrations, or EPCs, for the soil and groundwater contaminants in exposure units. The EPCs calculated for the exposure units represent the reasonable maximum exposure concentration likely to be contacted over time in soil and groundwater. For both soil and groundwater, Nucor evaluated exposure pathways at the facility, such as skin contact, inhalation, and ingestion. This figure shows examples of actual and potential contaminant migration pathways for a contaminant source. In the figure, the contaminant source is leaking drums at the left center of the figure. An example of a potential exposure pathway is a runner about to have direct contact with the pool of contamination. Nucor evaluated if there is a reasonable chance that an individual may be exposed to potentially impacted soil, groundwater, or air through a particular pathway, such as skin contact, inhalation, or ingestion. A pathway is considered to be complete if there is a chance that exposure to a contaminant could happen. For complete exposure pathways, Nucor used exposure point concentrations to calculate carcinogenic risk and hazard indices. The carcinogenic risk is a calculation of the number of people who could develop cancer as a result of exposure to a specific concentration of a carcinogen. A hazard index is the risk associated with non-carcinogenic effects. Nucor concluded that all exposure units or individual groundwater well locations were within or below EPA's acceptable carcinogenic risk for the identified receptors, and there were no hazard indices exceedances. In their risk assessment, Nucor identified a limited number of exposure pathways and evaluated several potential corrective measures to conservatively address the pathways. This slide shows estimated risks that remain at exposure units at the facility. Nucor has proposed remediation recommendations for the groundwater risks at exposure units 2 and 3, the billet yard and melt shop. The recommendations were to prevent residential or recreational use of the property, prohibit the installation of drinking water wells, and adhere to a soil and groundwater management plan. Restricting residential or recreational land use in this case will be done with a legal tool called an environmental restrictive covenant, which is a type of institutional or restrictive control. The land use control, which is in the legal property file in the courthouse, would prevent the Nucor property from being used for residential purposes and to ensure future occupants are protected from possible exposure via vapor intrusion. Vapor intrusion occurs when there is a migration of vapor-forming chemicals, like trichloroethene, from any subsurface into an overlying building. Land use control would also prohibit installation of drinking water wells and the use of groundwater at the facility as a source for drinking water. The environmental restrictive covenant, or the land use control, would be recorded on the deed of the property to notify potential future owners of these restrictions. Finally, a soil and groundwater management plan is a written document describing potential contaminants that could be encountered and is intended to protect on-site workers. The soil and groundwater management plan would provide requirements for personal protective equipment to be used, soil, groundwater, and air monitoring to be performed, and waste handling and disposal procedures to follow during construction or excavation work done on site. Additionally, EPA recommends and proposes that additional sampling and corrective measures be implemented at the former oil room, at the maintenance shop, machine press pit, new baghouse area, and that groundwater sampling be continued at the site for certain constituents of concern. At the former oil room at the maintenance shop, Nucor completed an interim measure to remove trichloroethene, a volatile organic compound used mostly in industrial and commercial processes, from soil and groundwater. Nucor then collected soil gas samples. The results revealed a complete vapor intrusion pathway. EPA was not able to draw a conclusion regarding vapor intrusion risk in the building based on the sampling results and proposes that Nucor collect additional soil gas samples. At the machine press pit area, Nucor performed an interim measure to remove oil from a groundwater well. EPA proposes that Nucor continue to remove oil from the well. At the new baghouse area, Nucor completed an interim measure that entailed excavating soil contaminated by emission control dust. After the excavation was completed, Nucor collected soil samples and found that there could be a risk for construction workers from residual lead contamination in soil. Excavating this lead is unworkable because of its close proximity to electrical infrastructure, a gas line, an air compressor building, and an underground water utility. The area is covered by concrete to prevent direct contact with the soils. EPA proposes that the cover over the contaminated new baghouse area be inspected annually for signs of deterioration. EPA also proposes that quarterly groundwater monitoring of select wells around the facility be conducted to ensure that any residual groundwater contamination remains stable. To summarize, these are the remedies EPA proposes for the Nucor site. Property restriction preventing residential or recreational use of the property, including prohibiting the installation of potable water wells. Adherence to a soil and groundwater management plan. Inspection and maintenance of cover over contaminated areas. Quarterly groundwater monitoring. Additional passive skimming to remove lubrication oil in groundwater. Collection of additional soil gas samples. Financial assurance and compliance with a long-term stewardship plan. Financial assurance refers to a requirement that Nucor demonstrates a financial ability to complete corrective action or cleanup, including carrying out the proposed remedy and monitoring facility conditions following remedy implementation. A long-term stewardship plan specifies what actions are required to be periodically completed to ensure that remedies are maintained and operated as intended, and that remedies remain protective over time and risks to human health and the environment are effectively controlled. All these remedies are designed to ensure long-term protection of human health and the environment, which means keeping the Nucor site safe for the surrounding community for years to come. EPA will issue a final decision documenting the selected remedy, meaning how the Nucor site will be cleaned up, after the public comment period on the statement of basis has ended. The final decision will include summary responses to public comments received on the statement of basis. The selected remedy will be put in place after EPA issues the final decision and response to comments document. The document will be added to the Nucor website and administrative record. This concludes the technical portion of our presentation.
Thank you for watching this presentation. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are multiple ways to submit your public comments on this proposed cleanup plan. You can leave a confidential voicemail at 312-886-7613. You can submit a comment directly on the website shown on the slide. You can also email the site's Community Involvement Coordinator, Francisco Arcaute, at arcaute.francisco@epa.gov. Finally, you can mail your written or typed comments to Francisco Arcaute at U.S. EPA, 77 West Jackson Boulevard, 19th floor, Chicago, Illinois, 60604. And of course, if you have any questions or need assistance with submitting a comment, you can contact Francisco, Community Involvement Coordinator, or Monica, Project Manager for this facility. Thanks again.